Listener discretion advised.
If you've been affected by the rampant opioid epidemic, as we have, then this podcast is for you. We want to bring hope to those suffering from heroin addiction and shed light on its darkness. Let's share an environment where we can discuss all aspects of heroin addiction without shame or judgment. Our mission is to educate the community about heroin and its deadly sidekick, fentanyl. How easy it is to get, how easy it is to become addicted, the latest treatments, and its newest targets. JCF is a nonprofit organization created to honor the life of Jeremy Castro, who passed away from a fentanyl overdose in 2017. Now, my family and I are doing our part to combat this opioid epidemic. I'm Rebecca Castro. I lost my brother and many friends to heroin, and I made this show to demand eradication of this epidemic. Let's do this.
Today I'm here with Dr. Matthew Torrington, and we're going to talk a little bit about surgery without opiates and pain reduction, pain management without opiates. So welcome, Dr. Torrington.
Thank you so much for having me.
Sure. So getting started, can you tell us a little bit about yourself, your practice?
Sure. I'm a family medicine doctor with a specialty in addiction medicine, and I'm board certified by the American Board of Addiction Medicine, which is actually the newest medical specialty, which is kind of funny. I got grandfathered into the American Board of Addiction Medicine, and I'm like pretty old, but I don't feel old enough to be a grandfather.
Right.
But it's cool because it shows that, American medicine is really rising to the challenge of impulse control disorders, and that we're doing our best to try and step up and meet the needs of our patients, which are struggling so much from these, brain illnesses associated with, drugs and alcohol.
Right. So do you think that mental illness is the root of addiction? Depression?
That's a tough question. So it's like the chicken and the egg, right?
Yes.
So when I get together with my psychiatrist friends, like we talk about, well, you got to treat the mood disorder before you can treat the addiction, or you got to treat the addiction before you have to treat the mood disorder. It's both.
Right.
And when your brain doesn't work right, it's harder to make good decisions.
Absolutely.
And addiction is an issue of impulse control.
Right.
So.
And I think there's probably certain stages in your life when your brain doesn't work correctly, like maybe adolescence, or for males up to the age of,
70.
Yeah.
No. But
27.
Yes, so that's
30.
that's a really great point. So one of the ways we like to explain that to adolescents that can be helpful is that if you think about your brain, it starts as like a Ziploc bag of liquid when you're a baby. It's just, you're like a clump of cells.
Right.
And by the time you get to be 45 or 50, your brain's like extra firm tofu. But when you're a teenager, it's like wet cement. Okay.
Oh.
And that if you start playing around on that wet cement, 13, 14, 15, 16, and getting exposed to alcohol and cannabinoids and other drugs, they can really leave a mark, a much more significant mark than if you get exposed to those drugs at 19, 20, 21, 20. And obviously the longer you wait, and if you could wait till 24, that would be the best, but that seems very unrealistic in today's society. However, especially for younger kids, it's really important to say, hey, look, you like to skateboard, you like to play basketball, you want to do that on smooth cement? Okay, well, it's not never, and we're not going to ever convince kids that they should never do anything, right? Because they're probably not going to buy that argument.
Right.
But they will buy the argument that you just need to wait until the cement is hard before you start playing on it.
Right.
And sometimes that can be helpful. But certainly the parts of the brain that tell us to go are excitatory mechanisms. They develop more quickly than the parts of our brains that tell us to say no. The inhibitory mechanisms, and especially in males, right?
Right.
They're a teenage boy, but they're just lunkheads. Like there's all sorts of crazy stuff that they do because they just don't think, or they don't stop, or whatever. And part of that has to do with the fact that their braking system in their brain develops slower than their gas system in their brain. So they're like overpowered cars with not enough brakes.
Wow, that is a great analogy. That really is. That makes so much sense. And in our line of work, what we're doing now, we're finding that kids start smoking weed 10 years old.
It's terrible.
10, 11 for sure. By the time they're 13, a lot of them have already done it, maybe start experimenting for sure with alcohol and maybe even pills. So do you think that starting pot smoking at that age can lead to depression? Or, I mean, you're telling me it does change the brain, or it leaves a marker on the brain?
It's a good question, and I don't know if there's conclusive data which really illustrates whether or not there's an increased incidence in mental health disorders associated with people who get exposed to substances early in life. Mm-hmm. But certainly it's not healthy, and it's not good for your brain, and it dramatically increases your chances of having a problem down the road.
Yes.
And that's part of what the point is that if you get exposed to these things before your brain is really able to handle them, which some people's brains just genetically aren't very well designed to handle anyway.
Right.
But especially if you get exposed younger, you're more likely to have a serious problem in the future.
Right. Well, I always say I've never met a heroin addict that didn't first start out smoking weed. Very rarely do you go from zero to addiction,
Yeah, I think it just depends on the environment, right? Because there's certainly places in the world where cannabis isn't really available,
right,
and people start with alcohol and then they go on to whatever's around. But certainly earlier exposure is a massively negative risk factor that, and by the way, the answer, in my opinion, is mostly about educating kids about why they shouldn't do this, because we can wave our fingers and tell them not to, and that's not going to really help as much as convincing them of why it's in their own best interest to not be wrecking their cement that they're going to want to play on forever.
Right. Good point. So how long have you been working with addiction patients?
So when I finished my residency in family medicine, I started in OBGYN, and then I switched into family medicine, and then right away I started working in an outpatient addiction treatment center in Wilmington, Delaware. And then there was this, used to be the American Society of Addiction Medicine had a certification exam in addiction medicine, which was the gold standard certification, pre-board. And so I began that process right away. And then when I moved to California around 2001, my first job, I was doing clinical research, and the clinical research was all medication development for substance abuse. And so, and that was a really interesting experience. And I stayed involved in clinical research for the next 12 years, mostly at UCLA through their integrated substance abuse program. So it's been quite a while now, almost 20 years.
Great. So can you tell us about your current day practice?
Yeah, so I have a really varied clinical life. So my primary focus is on my private practice, which is a longitudinal disease management paradigm.
Wow.
So,
okay, wait.
I know.
What does that mean?
That just means that I don't really do doctor as Applebee's, come when you want, get what you want, come back when you want. I only do month-to-month or year-to-year treatment because the data for addiction treatment shows that the longer you stay engaged, the better you do. So my motto is 10 years with me at retail is less than 1 month in premium residential.
Wow.
And so the idea is to as people do better and better, it should cost less and less because obviously they need to be seen less frequently, but it's easier to walk the tightrope when you keep the safety net up. And so the idea is to stay engaged and to continue to support the patients, helping them develop and implement their own comprehensive, individualized, multimodal treatment plan. Another big mouthful, but that just means that your recovery plan has to be biologic, it has to be psychological, it has to be social, it has to be spiritual, and it has to be nutritional. And we have to figure out for each individual what's the right combination of variables in each of those domains, and then we have to constantly update that plan over time based on their progress, what works, what doesn't work, what they like, what they don't like, what they can access, what they can't access. And then that's the paradigm over time that usually seems to work the best. In addition to that, we like to do testing, right? Trust, but verify, because it's really nice for patients to get to document their success. And it's one thing for me to meet with you and say you look great. It's another thing for me to meet with you, say you look great, and then also have some drug-free urine to put in the chart.
Right.
So we do that as well.
Wow.
And so that's one big piece of what I do. And I've been doing that longitudinal disease management model for over a decade now, and it's really working out, and I like that part. And then in addition to that, I have been supporting a free clinic, which is now associated with the Venice Family Clinic, once a week in Santa Monica, which I've been doing for about 12 years also.
Wow.
And that's really fun because, people get access to that kind of treatment in a way that they wouldn't have previously. And and the other thing is that we're teaching the doctors at the Venice Family Clinic, so every week when I'm there, not only am I taking care of a cohort of free patients, but I'm also training their doctors and PAs and NPs so that they get more experience, so that they're more comfortable taking those skills out into their regular practice.
Right.
Because there's a time when a lot of medicine really ignored these patients, and that doesn't help them, right? And we realize that this is a biologic issue that responds well to disease management, just like obesity, just like diabetes, just like high blood pressure, and that if we engage in that, we get better outcomes.
Well, it sounds like you offer a concierge service, and it sounds like it's also going to be the new model for addiction treatment. It sounds like that would be very effective because honestly, I had a son who was an addict, and we would put him in rehab, and he would do his 30 days or, whatever.
Minimum requirements in rehab.
Minimum requirements, and frankly, as long as I could keep him there. And then he'd come out, and one time I sent him to live with his aunt, then his other aunt, but ultimately he relapsed. And I think if you had somebody there holding your hand every step of the way and saying, this is the path, this is how we can help you, I would think that you have a high success rate.
I hope so. But at the same time, sometimes we do everything that we can and it doesn't work.
I know. That's
so it's
true.
not so there's no guarantees. But for me, I always feel like if you have a severe life-threatening brain disease like addiction, you should have a licensed expert of, the highest qualifications you can get helping you navigate that problem over time, because we know that addiction is a disease characterized by relapse. It always comes back. My analogy for that is that, addiction is like an assassin that cashed the check. As soon as you take your bulletproof vest off, as soon as you decide not to get bulletproof glass in your car this time, as soon as you let the Secret Service go home, the shots are going to get fired.
Yeah.
That's exactly what happens. It's the way that you put that, it's so true. And I think the big thing too, though, with you being successful is that it's so personalized with each person, like you said, like mind, body, soul, diet, everything needs to be changed. And I don't think a lot of doctors or even some rehabs focus on all aspects of that. You know what I mean? It's more just like, let's take care of the physical withdrawals and okay, now that that's out of the way, let's move forward on how you're going to have a good life. But there's a lot of changing that has to be done in the process.
I totally agree.
Right?
And one of the issues in the current paradigm is that everything is siloed, right? So the doctor provides their little piece, the therapist provides their little piece, the administrator provides their little piece, everybody, but no one is really coordinating it. And what I'm always trying to do is I'm trying to coordinate with the sponsor and the therapist and the primary care doctor and the psychiatrist and the parents and whoever, and the yoga coach, whoever's on the team, try and keep everybody moving in the same direction and helping the patient navigate the process. But remember, the patient is always the quarterback and the captain and the coach. And so, I could be like a great wide receiver, but you got to get me on the field, you got to call my play, and then you got to throw the ball down there. I'll jump up and get it, right? And I can really good at doing my part, but there's a lot of other parts that have to happen, and sort of helping people, assemble their team and keep it rolling over time, And then also being there to roll with them through the ups and downs. This isn't one of those things where you're just like, if somebody has a setback, you don't give up.
Yeah.
Right.
You redouble your efforts and you
Right.
keep moving forward, and you don't, this is, and also in the care and management of people with addiction problems, shaming them, being negative with them, that never helps, right? I mean, like we used to
Never.
have Synanon where they would literally shave your head and put a sign on your chest that said like, I'm a jerk. And they would scream at you for a while, and until the next crop of kids came in and they shaved their heads, and then they got to do the scream. Like, that doesn't help.
I know. These kids already have so much shame, and people might think that they don't because they act a different way, but that's just the drug. She's like, they already have so much shame on them. Putting more shame is not going to help them recover in any way. It's probably going to make them take a step back, honestly. Like, it's just not, and that's a really big thing.
It's not productive.
It's not productive.
Yeah.
It's not productive.
So if I were to come to you for the first time as an opiate addict due to like back pain, severe back pain, what would typically be your protocol? I mean, I know you don't, it's not a cookie cutter, but for instance,
the
how would you
idea would
tell
be
me?
the first, and one of the things about my practice that I really like is I get as much time as I need.
Yeah.
Right? So like I usually budget 1 hour for the first session, but like pretty frequent, like last week I had a patient who came in for 1 hour, and at 1 hour we had just scratched the surface. And unfortunately I had something right after, and I said, okay, listen, I'm sorry we're not done, because sometimes in an hour I have a plan all made up and we're ready to roll. But this time I didn't, so I was like, okay, let's reconvene. Then we took another 90 minutes, and then we finally got it all tight.
Okay.
Sometimes I can do it in as fast as 30 minutes. Sometimes at the clinic. So, but the idea is to meet with the patient, to understand where they're coming from and what's going on, obviously to understand what their medical history is, their surgical history, what medications they're taking, if they're allergic to anything, family history, social background, substance abuse inventory, current status, and then a brief physical exam and a urine test, and trying to figure out like what's the first step in your comprehensive, individualized, multimodal treatment plan, which I kind of segregate into biologic, psychologic, social, spiritual, and nutritional. And so for somebody with opiate use disorder, it may be outpatient detox, it may be inpatient detox, it may be transition to buprenorphine, which is a partial opiate agonist, which saturates opiate receptors in the brain and makes them think that they're full when they're only partially activated. So it blocks craving and prevents withdrawal, which is really helpful for patients, right? Because
I want to definitely talk about that in depth. But is that something you prescribe or you inject?
That's a medication that
that
you can prescribe, that doctors with special certification can prescribe.
Okay.
And there's certain trainings that you have to do in order to be able to do that.
Sure.
But it's very effective, very safe, and can be really helpful. But there's a lot of different ways to handle these problems, and the whole idea is trying to find the way that's going to be best suited for the patient based on what they need, what their experiences have been, what they like, what they don't like, what makes the most sense, what's cost effective for them.
Right. So, for instance, in a new patient or semi-new patient, you would say, let's address your anxiety, let's address your, physical limitations, something like that. So you might suggest yoga, you might suggest meditation.
Absolutely. So it could be, so like, if you think about a patient, contemporary American patient with diabetes, right?
Right.
Every one of them is going to see an ophthalmologist every year. They're going to see a podiatrist every year. They're going to have a primary care doctor. They're going to have a nutritionist probably. They're going to maybe even have a home health worker who's going to look at their meds. They're going to have a primary care doctor. They're going to, maybe if their disease is severe, they may have an endocrinologist. They may have a cardiologist. They may have a nephrologist. A patient with addiction should have, in my opinion, right, an addiction specialist, a primary care doctor. They may have a psychiatrist. They probably should have a therapist, right? Then they may have a yoga or meditation coach. They should probably have a sponsor of some kind, right?
Right.
They need to be engaged in exercise. They need to be working on their diet, like all of these things. And the whole idea is, how do you develop the right plan for them? Now, obviously, if they have a severe orthopedic problem, they're going to need an orthopod that really understands what's going on. You're going to have to coordinate with them. And then if they have to have surgery, right, what are you going to do? How are you going to manage that in terms of this? And that's really a lot of, how we approach these
Right.
situations, but always in an individualized way.
Well, I love that because there's a start, but there's not necessarily a quick finish. And like there is with rehab, you start, January 1 and you come home January 30th, or you need to find a place to live. You know what I'm saying?
And there's no data that really
Yeah.
suggests that after 30 days everyone's fixed, right? So it's one of those things that my research mentor, Dr. Walter Lang, is an incredible influence in my life. And he always used to like to say, detox is good for a lot of things, but keeping people off of drugs isn't one of them.
Right.
Right.
So if if you're in the battle, in some, battlefield, and you get shot and you go to the hospital and they get the bullet out, that's great. But it doesn't keep you from getting shot again. Right?
Right.
So detox is like getting the bullet out, but it doesn't really address why you got shot in the first place. And then when you go back into the environment, when you go back on the battlefield, that's when the work really starts. So no matter how much momentum you build up in residential, and I'm not hating on residential because sometimes it's incredibly helpful and necessary to help people build momentum.
I think it's a step.
Correct. Yeah.
It's
and
not
it should
the
just
end
be the
all.
entry into outpatient because ongoing care really makes a difference.
Huge. And I wish I would have known about you or your type of practice, when Jeremy was alive, because I knew for sure he was not finished day 30. And then it's like, oh my gosh, now what are we going to do? How are we going to keep him, safe? How are we going to babysit him? And what environment does he need? So I think that the long-term practice and the personal attention you offer is huge. And I'm hoping,
It's the best I can think of so far.
Yeah,
It's
great.
really great.
I'm literally I remember working in residential and being incredibly frustrated. At one particular moment, a mom called me. Their patient they lived in the Midwest, and they had sent their kid to Malibu to a fancy residential program where I was working, and he really built a lot of momentum over 60 days. And then she called, and she was in distress and not sure what to do. He'd been home about a week, and I was like, is he seeing the therapist? Is he seeing the psychiatrist? Is he taking the medication? She's like, oh, no, we spent all our money on his treatment.
Right.
And I was like, it's a marathon, not a sprint. You don't want to use all your gunpowder in the first battle. You need to think of it as a more long-term thing, because nobody's going to be all better and fixed after 30, 60, or 90 days. They may be improved. They may have gotten better. And by the way, there are some people who will be. Right? Every once in a while, somebody is, really, their illness isn't that severe, and they really do get all better in 30, 60, or 90 days, and they never need any more treatment. But that's more of the exception than the rule.
But with TV commercials, the sale is come to us for 30 days, get clean, change your life, live a new life. That's fabulous, but, you can't, quote, fix someone in 30 days or 60 days or 90 days. Especially with opiate use, I find that I think people need treatment, whether it's, residential, outpatient, whatever, for at least a year. Don't you think, to reset your brain, or longer?
For sure. And if you study addiction research, the variable that predicts outcomes better than any other variable is duration of treatment. So the longer you stay engaged in treatment, the better you do. So the whole idea for my private practice was to try and stretch it out, to try and get people to stay engaged for longer. And that's part of why I invented the contingency management inspired de-escalating fee schedule. I wanted to give people money back, actually, as they did better. But the guy who wrote my contract was like, dude, it's too complicated. I can't figure that out.
Yeah.
So tell us about that. What's
so
the
instead
thought?
it just gets cheaper, right? Because as you when you're unstable, you may require I may be in daily contact with you, right?
Oh, okay.
But when you've got 6 years of sobriety, right? It's not that you should get discharged. It's just that you only need to come in every 3 months, and I'm there for you anytime you need in the interim. And it's not like you need to spend all your time engaging and coming to see me, but it's nice to stay engaged and keep working on where your plan is. And remember, the energy, and if the biggest mistake that we make in your recovery is that we spend too much energy protecting you, to me that's like,
Right.
if addiction is an assassin that casts a check, we're guarding Jimmy Carter right now. The
Right.
Secret Service is sitting outside his house. I don't think anybody wants to kill Jimmy. But we're going to guard him anyway. And then when he dies and we bury him, we're going to guard that place too, because we can and we should. And if, that's kind of the way I think about it. If the biggest mistake that we make is that we over defend you, I think that's a mistake worth making.
I love that
Absolutely.
philosophy.
Me
I
too.
do. And I could see that, it's probably very successful, I would guess.
It's not the kind of thing that lends itself to study, right? Because there's no control group, and but my theory is that I would be miserable if I didn't have enough time to really address the patient's needs, whatever they were. I like to have time to do that, and so I have a relatively low volume of patients, and try not to spread myself so thin that I can't really do whatever needs to be done and still be a person, and so and that's part of why I'm always trying to teach, right? Because I know I can't take care of everybody who needs help. So we have to teach more doctors and try and because every time we teach somebody something, that's good, because then they can use that knowledge. And we don't have enough doctors who know about addiction.
Right.
Doctors didn't really take this on until recently. And so it was got ignored and swept under the rug and passed off from person to person. And you had these, we cracked down on opiate prescribing, and the doctor's answer was, "You're fired."
Right.
To the patient. That doesn't help.
No.
That just makes that patient twice as vulnerable to bad things. So, so that's a big part of the idea.
Yeah. So can you talk to us about opiate blockers?
Yeah,
Medication.
so let's just talk about sort of the treatment of opiate use disorder is sort of how we think about that. And we have 3 classes of FDA-approved medications. We have full agonists, which is methadone, right, which is a long-acting opioid that saturates opiate receptors in the brain, fully activating them. Once you take the medicine once a day, it has a long half-life, and it just stops the brain from telling the patient that they're starving to death for opiates the way I'd be starving to death for oxygen with a plastic bag over my head. Because that's the kind of signaling that the brain uses to tell people that they need to keep using. And so full agonists do that. And then partial agonists like buprenorphine, what that does is it does the same kind of thing, partially activating the receptors, blocking craving, preventing withdrawal, but without the fully activated effect. So buprenorphine has a ceiling effect on respiratory depression, sedation, and euphoria. So even if you take 5 times your normal dose, you don't get high, you don't pass out, you don't stop breathing.
Okay.
You maybe get a headache, you maybe get constipated, but you're not going to die. Whereas if you took 5 times your dose of methadone, you could die. Or an opiate naive person takes methadone and they could die. Buprenorphine, if an opiate naive person takes it, it'll mess you up, but it's not going to kill you necessarily unless you're a child or there are other drugs on board. But it could be, but it's serious. All forms of medication-assisted treatment are serious. And naltrexone, which you started your question with, right? Finally getting there, right, is the opiate blocker. And what that does is that binds to the opiate receptors and just makes it so that nothing can get in. It's kind of like a locked door with a dummy key in the lock. That key's not going to open the lock. You can't open that door until you get the dummy key out and put the right key in. And that's what naltrexone does. And there's oral naltrexone and there's long-acting depot naltrexone, a shot that lasts about a month. And that works great when it's on board. The main downside with that is that when it's gone, the opiate receptors are more like pre-exposure opiate receptors, and those patients are more vulnerable to overdose in the future.
Wow.
Did you share with him our situation with the doctor? You should.
So my son was on Vivitrol injections. He was in rehab and in January and wanted to come home February 15th. And I said, you can come home back, but you have to be on Vivitrol. You have to be on the injection. And so the rehab place injected him. The next month we found a doctor to inject him, 2 days early, whatever. I'm like, you're not going over day 30.
And he was amazing. He was amazing on it.
And what he told me is, Mom, it's like I've never used heroin. I don't crave it. I don't think about it ever. It's like I've never used, because he doesn't have that constant, how am I getting it? Where's the money coming from? Is my dealer in town? Nothing. And so he was able to function, and at that time he was looking for a job and filling out applications, and he was doing very well. And the 3rd month, his Vivitrol was delivered, but a mess up in the delivery according to the doctor. So the doctor wasn't around, or it wasn't available for him to be injected. And 2 weeks to the day he missed that appointment, he died of an overdose. Like, he couldn't hold on, you know. We kept him busy. My husband worked 12 hours a day. I mean, we just occupied his time, you know, Jer, hanging. And the whole time I'm calling the pharmacy, you know, and CVS and the doctor.
I remember
do you understand how important this is? So I'm like freaking out, you know, at the other end, and we're trying to keep him busy. And
I remember that phone call.
She couldn't.
She was freaking out because he said, "Mom, I went to go get my shot, but there was no one there to administer it." And she picks up the phone. Her exact words, like, "This shot is the difference between life and death." And it honestly was, because like you said, 2 weeks later.
Yeah, it turned out to be true. So
right before he was going to start a new job, the day before or the night before, right? EMT job. So...
It's so terrible. I'm so sorry.
It is terrible. But
and you know, my perspective is that sometimes no matter what we do, it doesn't work.
Exactly.
But in my experience, the more comprehensive, the more individualized, the more multimodal your plan is, and the longer you employ it, the more likely you are to be successful.
Right.
Absolutely.
And you know, that's the downside. And every single medication has a downside. Every single treatment that you're going to engage in has a downside. Nothing is perfect. There is no guarantee. There is no cure. I don't like to use the C word, right? Because we don't know about a cure. We know that there are things we can do that help. There are all sorts of things that we can do. But really, there isn't anything we can do that takes your risk level and takes it to zero.
Right.
Absolutely.
Well, you know, that I've struggled with that for 2 years, but you know what? Ultimately, it was fate, and which is why we're doing what we're doing now. You know, because if we could save one person from, you know, one parent from losing a child, then that's what we want to do. So, you know, we appreciate you coming on and explaining to us your method of treatment, which I love very much.
Me too.
And we will definitely post on our website your information. You know, it's a huge help.
I think that, and also just so you know, one of the reasons, I love everything you said. I think you hit the nail on the head with everything you said and the way you explained everything. And one of the reasons that we do this also is because we don't feel that enough people see it as an illness or a disease. We don't feel that they're very accepting of it. So this negative connotation around heroin addicts, and you know, I had a lot of friends in high school or whenever Jeremy was doing it that would just say like, "Can't he just stop?" And there were times where I literally was just like, "Why doesn't he just stop?" But people just don't really understand how like it just swallows you whole. And like you said, it's not an easy fix. It's not 30, 60, or 90 days. And every time Jeremy went into rehab, he was just counting down like, okay, it's my 15th day. I'm almost out of here, you know? But it's not. It's a whole lifestyle change. And so how you say that there's no time limit on it, I think your method is amazing. And I want to thank you for coming on the show.
No problem. I think that perspective is really important, and I think one way to think about that I think is helpful is, you know, your brain has a lot of different parts. It's the most complicated thing ever, basically. And the front part of your brain, with your new or neocortex, that's where you make executive decisions, like how to show up on time for a podcast, or, you know, or what you're going to wear, or where you're going to go, what you're going to say. You have a lot of control over that, just like you have a lot of control over your phone and what buttons you push and or whether you make the call or don't make the call. That's really different from the back part of your brain, with your brainstem and your cerebellum that runs your pancreas and your liver and your spleen and your bone marrow. I don't care how smart you are, you probably can't control your bone marrow.
Yes.
But your brain does,
Yeah.
right? I mean, your brain is in charge of everything, but you just don't have any conscious control over that part of your brain, right? In the middle of your brain is a constellation of brain structures that we call the limbic brain. This is the part of the brain that motivates humans to breathe more frequently than we eat, more frequently than we sleep, more frequently than we have sex. That's what we do, right? That's why there's so many of us, because we're awesome at breathing, eating, sleeping, and having sex. And I don't care how angry you are when you're 8 years old, you cannot hold your breath until you die.
Yes.
Because even if you're so mad at me that you didn't buy me the Twizzlers, and like you're going to hold your breath and show me, like eventually, if you're really amazing at holding your breath, eventually your limbic brain will turn off your neocortex, you'll lose consciousness, and you'll take a breath immediately. Because your limbic brain was programmed for survival. If you get hungry, right? If you miss breakfast, you're probably not going to steal my lunch. But if you haven't eaten in 3 days, you might steal my lunch.
Absolutely.
No matter how well your mom raised you. You're starving.
Totally.
You see Naked and Afraid. People eat anything eventually, right?
Right? Yeah.
So the point is that once you get to the survival center, your limbic brain can manipulate the way that you think and the way that you feel to get you to engage in activities that you wouldn't normally do. And this is the terrifying truth about why these things happen. So when an opiate patient is in withdrawal and they're getting fevers and chills and sweats and nausea and vomiting and diarrhea and runny nose and watery eyes and muscle pain and bone pain and joint pain and restlessness and agitation, insomnia, irritability, that's the limbic brain pushing on the buttons in the brainstem and cerebellum to make you feel so sick that you're going to get at what it wants.
Oh my gosh.
And if that's not terrifying enough, because I think that's absolutely terrifying.
It is.
Because you're not really sick, but you're really sick, okay? At the same time that the limbic brain can manipulate the way you feel, it can also rewrite your teleprompter, Ron Burgundy style, okay, to get you to say and think things that don't make sense. It doesn't matter. I can stop later. No one can tell. I'll just do it one more time. All those terrible thoughts that get people to engage in this negative behavior, it's in there rewriting the teleprompter, and the text is not color coded.
Oh my gosh.
So people don't even know their own brain is malfunctioning to get them to do things that they wouldn't normally do. Just like if you guys try to kill me with a plastic bag and I'm starving to death for oxygen, I'm going to try and hurt you.
Yeah.
Right? Because I want to survive.
Yes.
And even though that might not seem like a dignified thing to do, when it's life or death, you're going to do anything. And that's the kind of survival machinery that the limbic brain has access to, and that's part of why it can be so difficult for patients. And some patients may need medication-assisted treatment of either fully activating, partially activating, or antagonizing over time their receptors so that they can build enough momentum psychologically, socially, spiritually, nutritionally, and biologically that they're doing well enough that they don't need that help in order to keep moving forward.
Oh my gosh.
Does that make sense?
It makes sense, but that's so...
I want to be a brain doctor now.
Oh my gosh, that's so... Oof.
So I have a question.
Amazing.
Is there no medication or no treatment to like keep that limbic part of your brain in check?
Not that we know of.
Not
Now,
yet.
the things that seem to work the best, right, are mind-body activities. So if you're meditating or you're praying, right, both of those things are like push-ups for your neocortex.
Okay.
I don't know if you ever tried to meditate before, but like, you know, I have a busy brain and it's really hard for me. My brain's like, dude, come on, really?
Yeah, me too.
I got to do laundry.
But when you sit there and focus on trying to like acknowledge those thoughts and release them, that's using your neocortex to control the way that you think. That's the exact opposite of getting loaded, right?
Okay,
so it's
yeah.
like push-ups for your neocortex. So you can't have your neocortex be too strong. That's one thing. Another thing we can do is avoid exposure to things that release a lot of dopamine, right? So that currency of reward, you know, you get a penny for a breath, you get a quarter for food, you get 50 cents for sleep, you get $1 or $2 for sex, depending on how that goes down. Heroin pays $1,000. Okay, and so the whole idea is when you get exposed to things that cause a huge dopamine spike, that gets the limbic brain primed for more dopamine spikes. So all those things that go together, like Las Vegas, smoking, drinking, gambling, sex, they all release a lot of dopamine, and the more of one you engage in, the more the others are more appealing to you. So if you're operating in more of a normal dopamine economy of dollars and cents with, you know, petting dogs and taking care of children and growing gardens and being engaged in productive work, which doesn't pay those huge spikes, but actually like pays like good money over time. Right. That's like makes it easier for you than if you're, getting exposed to tons of sugar and smoking cigarettes and gambling and engaged in risky sex. All those things are like, they make you more impulsive.
So why do you think all these addictions or addiction is so much more prevalent now?
I'm not sure if it's more prevalent. I think that we're more attuned to it, and that some of the things that we're getting exposed to kill us faster. Like if you look at history of like the alcohol and other things that people got exposed to, I don't really know. I don't think that the data is there to really say like how much more prevalent it is. We know a lot of people are dying, but the reason they're dying is because the things they're getting exposed to are so much more lethal. And that's part of why we're having such a problem, because our technology has developed these substances that release so much more dopamine than our brains were designed to handle, right? Like, so we were designed to have a dopamine economy of dollars and cents, and now there's all these things that pay hundreds and thousands, and our brains are not well designed to handle those, especially based on your genetics. Also, some of the things I think that used to protect us, psychosocial factors, right? You grew up in a small town, you stayed in a small town.
Right.
And that you went to the same church where everybody else went, you were in the same club as everybody else, and that really there was a social structure there. And if you deviated from the social structure too much, there were real consequences for you over time. And now, the way society has changed, and we have so much autonomy and so much anonymity, that it's really hard to determine, like some of that structure is just gone. Church is at an all-time low. Civic participation is at an all-time low. We're connected by the internet, but we're more isolated than ever.
Right.
And I think that some of that stuff, and remember, humans originally lived in tribes, and then extended families, and then nuclear families, and then single-parent families where the single parent works. Where's the structure? Where's the nurturing? Where's the environment that's going to help protect kids and give them some of that psychosocial structure and support, which has been replaced by technology and television and marketing and media and all these things, which aren't bad by themselves, but really I think that may be playing a role in why we're more susceptible now. It's the intensity of the actual substances, the lack of psychosocial support, the isolationism. I'm not sure. But it's certainly it's definitely multifactorial.
So we talked about some opiate blockers and different methods of treatment. Have you heard of ayahuasca?
I have, and there's a really interesting push and surge for what's usually called plant-based medicine with some hallucinogens and different things, and it's very, very interesting, and there's more and more work being done all the time. And when I think about those compounds, I sort of think of them as a general class. Now, unfortunately, in the United States, they're still illegal.
Right.
So it's not something that we've been able to study the way that we should be studying them, and so that's a problem on the research side. But as a clinical researcher, what you learn about clinical research is it's very slow. It's very expensive, and you only get to answer one tiny little piece of a question at a time at a great cost. So it's extremely laborious, and so that's part of the reason that we don't have the kind of data about that we would like.
Right.
With that said, there appear to be two separate mechanisms of action for each of these hallucinogenic things, whether it's 5-MeO-DMT or ayahuasca or ibogaine. So it turns out that there are probably two separate mechanisms. One mechanism is a biologic mechanism at the receptors, and that's going to be different for each of the hallucinogens. They're going to work a little bit differently in the brain, but they do something specific at the receptor site that tends to be helpful, okay? Moreover, there's something about the hallucinogenic experience which helps people alter their perceptions, okay? Because everything in life is based on our perceptions, and part of the way the mechanism of action of hallucinogens is they turn off the default mode network in the brain, which is basically where we store all of our preconceived ideas. We conceive of ideas, and then they get stored in there, and they're like, oh, I am blank, and this is what defines me. And when hallucinogens are on board, that gets turned down or even off. And that in that state of having your perceptions altered, sometimes people can make psychologic breakthroughs where they literally learn something about themselves, or they're able to get rid of a preconceived idea about themselves that they realize, or they're able to see more clearly without having their vision tainted by their preconceived ideas. And so there's a biologic faction sometimes that is helpful in the use of plant-based medicine, and then there can also be psychological gains that are gained and insights that happen during the experience. And a lot of that depends on the set of the individual, the setting that they're in, who's with them and what's going on, and whether they're getting counseling or they're getting guided during that. And there's a huge amount of variability in that space, but it's certainly something that, look, I'll take every single tool. I want more tools. I only have a fraction of the number of tools that I need in order to be successful. We're not winning enough.
Right.
So for me, I'm open to all things, but as a scientist, I want scientific rigor, I want safety, I want proven efficacy, and when I can't get it, I'll do my best with what I've got. But obviously, there's definitely something going on there, and there are plenty of people who've had really good experiences. My own patients have had good experiences. Others, not so much.
Right.
It really depends on the individual, and so we don't always know with any particular biologic or psychologic intervention how well it's going to work for an individual. But that doesn't mean it's not worth trying.
Right. I agree. So I'm wondering, you said it attaches or it affects your receptors. What part of the brain are your receptors in?
So, so there are receptors everywhere, and it just depends on and there's a gazillion different receptors.
Okay.
And so I think that's sort of beyond the scope of this particular venue to sort of try and get into the different kind of receptors and where they are.
Okay.
It's more like and each person has a different constellation of receptors in their brain.
Oh boy.
Everybody's a little bit different.
Yeah.
So no two brains are exactly the same. So it's just basically those are the kind of targets that we think about pharmacologically about where things work and then what kind of action happens at the receptor level, and then we try and infer based on the science and then what we see clinically kind of how those medicines are going to work and how they're going to be tolerated and what the best way to use them to help patients get better.
I really want to get to that limbic part. I really want to have something get in there that can maybe control your thoughts more.
Why don't you?
Yeah,
There's your next project.
I know, but it's but look, it's the ultimate question throughout time. It's it's the 7 deadly sins. It's everything about humans is about the internal battle between what you know is right and what the other part of your brain wants. It's when I was a kid and the little cartoon with the devil on one shoulder and the angel on the other shoulder.
Right.
The devil's like the limbic brain and the angel's like the neocortex, and it's this question of what's right and what's wrong, what's right for me. And humans generally don't always pick what's right for them.
Isn't that the truth?
Sure. I mean, and when you think about what are our big problems? We haven't talked about food at all. Right. 2/3 of Americans are overweight. Almost a full third are obese.
Yeah.
Nobody wants to be overweight. Nobody wants to be obese. But people's brains continue to manipulate the way that they think and the way that they feel to get them to consume more calories than they can burn.
Right.
And it's not just the food. The high fructose corn syrup and the partially hydrogenated fatty acids are certainly bad, but it's not just the food. It has to do with how that fits into everything else. And so those comprehensive, individualized, multimodal strategies are going to be most effective in helping people achieve their goals.
Wow. So this has been fascinating, and thank you very much. Is there anything you'd like to say in closing?
I would just say that for anybody who has a problem or is trying to support someone having a problem, don't give up, right? Stick with it.
Yeah.
Addiction is a disease characterized by relapse. Don't give up. And try and look at how to make a longer plan that addresses as many of the issues as possible. And the more you stick with it, the better it's going to get. And it may seem overwhelming, but so does building a house. If you look at a grove of trees and you're I'm going to put a house here, you think about the number of things you have to do, the number of people that have to get involved, the amount of work that goes into it, the amount of time it takes. But, if you stick with it, and you keep working on it, you get there.
Right.
And it's kind of like one of those things where it's people have to really, if you look at it in those terms, instead of oh, I got shot, I'm going to get the bullet out, I'm going to get detoxed, everything's going to be fine. No, that's the beginning. That's negative 1,000 to 0, and you're trying to get to 1,000,000.
Right.
So you just have to get, and then all the work starts really after detox.
Right. Right. That's like a stepping stone.
Yeah.
I agree. Well, I love your never give up, mentality. We never give up. We don't think anybody, our mantra is never helpless, never hopeless. And, for every addict, there's always hope. You know, every day you wake up, there's hope. So
I totally agree with you, and that's
Yeah.
one of the things I love about my job. Is it's like
Yeah.
I don't think I'd be that happy as like an oncologist working on some terrible cancer.
Right.
All my patients can get better. They don't all get better, but they all might.
Right.
And so it's really just like, how do we empower them to give them the best chance of making it? And believe me, when they don't, it's devastating. But some of them do, and that's our job, is to try and help each person have a better chance of making it.
And that's what makes it worth it, is the people that do make it. And that's that's why we're doing it. We're not giving up on anyone.
Yeah.
But thank you so much for being here. Really, that was so knowledgeable. Thank you for sharing everything with us. And
yeah, thank you for educating us.
thank you.
It's my pleasure.
It's
Thanks for having me.
fascinating.
Okay,
All
take
right.
care.
Thank you.
You just heard the podcast $20, produced by Rose and Rebecca Castro and Berta DeQuay, recorded at the New Media Agency Studios in Los Angeles.